What if the stories you were told about magic babies and hovering angels and, underground goblins licking a magical metal wall weren't fairy tales at all?
Right. What if they were something else entirely?
Exactly. Imagine finding these incredibly complex mathematical blueprints for a global socioeconomic survival system, like something that could literally prevent the collapse of human civilization.
Wow.
But because those blueprints were written in an ancient poetic language, the people who found them just thought it was a book of magic spells.
Oh, that is such a powerful way to frame it.
Right. So they spent centuries basically just worshiping the paper it was written on. They were chanting the words without understanding the engineering behind them, just watching their societies crumble around them.
And they end up treating this advanced technical manual for civilizational sustainability as, well, as a collection of bedtime stories. I mean, it is genuinely one of the greatest intellectual tragedies in human history.
It really is. And breaking down that exact tragedy is our mission for today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
So glad to be here.
Today we are diving into a really fascinating, fiercely intellectual lecture delivered on October 16th, 1967. And it focuses on a very specific block of text. We're looking at Surah Al-Anbiya, which is chapter 21, verses 89 through 96.
And quick warning for you listening right now, if you have any preconceived notions about these verses, you really need to leave them at the door today.
Yeah, we are putting the fairy tales away for this one. Today we're looking at this text through a strictly rational macro-sociological lens.
Which honestly is the only lens that actually makes the text functional. I mean, the source material we are examining today completely shatters that primitive, superstitious narrative.
It really does.
It argues that all these supernatural interpretations that people cling to, they're simply mythological placeholders.
Placeholders for what, exactly?
For advanced principles of sociology, demographic engineering, and systemic vulnerability. Principles that were staring them right in the face the whole time, but they just didn't understand the mechanics.
Well, let's talk about those placeholders right off the bat, because they are deeply, deeply ingrained in the culture.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, if you look at the traditional surface-level translations, this chapter reads straight up like a fantasy novel.
Yeah.
You have this man named Zechariah who is 90 years old, right?
Right.
And he suddenly gets a child through literal magic.
Right.
Then you have Mary conceiving through a spell where an angel literally blows air into her dress.
Yeah, it's very literal.
And then, it hits the ultimate theological horror story, this terrifying prophecy about ugly underground goblins named Gog and Magog.
Yeah.
Or Yajuj and Majuj.
The famous goblins.
Exactly. And the story goes that they are trapped behind this massive iron wall deep inside the earth, just licking the wall every day, waiting to break out and eat the world at the end of time.
I mean, it sounds completely absurd when you lay it out like that, right?
It really does.
Yet millions of people accept it without question. But the thing is, when we strip away that folklore, what we are actually looking at is a high-level briefing.
Okay, unpack that for me. A briefing on what?
This text is analyzing how a revolutionary movement strategically optimizes its human capital when it's facing total extinction.
Wow, okay.
And it contrasts that optimization with how civilizations inevitably fracture into weaponized factions. And then it concludes with this terrifyingly precise breakdown of what happens when global security dams finally break down.
That is a massive paradigm shift. But to understand how we get from, magic babies to demographic engineering, we have to start where the source starts.
Right, the foundations.
Yeah, we have to completely redefine the central figures of this text, the leaders that are typically referred to as prophets. Because if we misunderstand who these people were, we misunderstand everything they did.
The problem really begins with the modern definition of religion itself. When we hear that word, or the word prophet, we have been so conditioned to picture monks or saints or spiritual gurus.
Yeah, totally. We picture someone sitting on a mountain somewhere, totally isolated from society. Exactly, chanting, focusing purely on inward purification, maybe coming down to tell people how to conduct their marriages or their funerals.
Right.
Like, they're the guy you go to for a blessing. They're definitely not the guy you go to when the global supply chain collapses.
Right. But the source material explicitly counters this assumption. These figures were not mythical gurus seeking personal enlightenment in a cave somewhere.
So what were they?
They were system architects. They were builders of an entirely new socioeconomic and political reality.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the source actually makes a really provocative comparison here to illustrate the sheer scale of what these figures were doing.
Oh, right, the historical comparison.
Yeah. It asks us to look at the major secular, political, and revolutionary leaders of history. It impartially mentions figures like Hitler, Mussolini, Lenin, and Mao.
And we should be absolutely clear here for you listening. The source is not at all endorsing their atrocities or their ideologies. We are just impartially reporting on the text's examples.
Exactly, yes. Thank you. It is strictly referencing the mechanics of their leadership, the scale of their impact.
Right.
These were individuals who completely overhauled public laws, they redefined economies, and entirely restructured the political frameworks of their nations.
They didn't just preach morality on a street corner.
No, they changed the operating system of society.
They were macro engineers. But I have a question about that. If the prophetic figures were also macro engineers, what makes their system any different?
What do you mean?
Well, if they're just politicians with a religious veneer, that isn't particularly revolutionary, right? We've seen state building before. It happens all the time.
Well, the difference lies in what the source calls a dual optimization.
Okay, dual optimization.
Let's look at those purely secular systems we just mentioned. They might overhaul the economy, sure, but they almost always do so by treating human beings as mere cogs in a machine.
Right. They sacrifice the individual for the state.
Exactly. They sacrifice the holistic development of the individual for the sake of the greater political machine. But then, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the purely monastic systems.
The monks on the mountain.
Yeah. They focus entirely on the individual's spiritual state, and they completely abandon the socioeconomic realities of the world.
So they teach you to meditate while tyrants are out there actively exploiting the working class.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That is the historical binary. One system starves your humanity to build a factory, and the other tells you to feel spiritually fulfilled while you literally starve in the street.
Wow, that is a bleak binary.
It is. But the prophetic system, at least according to this analysis, is entirely unique because it bridges that gap.
How so?
It is designed to simultaneously develop the individual's highest human potential and construct a just, equitable socioeconomic structure that facilitates that development.
So you need both.
Yes. You cannot have one without the other. The individual needs a just society to thrive, and a just society requires fully developed, conscientious individuals to actually maintain it.
I hear that, and it makes sense in theory, but I have to push back a little here.
Go for it.
If these architects brought this perfectly balanced dual optimization system, why does history show us that, like, just a few generations after these leaders die, their followers are right back to the monasteries?
Oh, the regression.
Yeah, they fall right back into the empty rituals and the exact same economic exploitation the system was supposed to eliminate in the first place.
Well, that degradation of the original parameters is, unfortunately, the tragic cycle of human history.
You know, it really makes me think of an IT analogy.
Oh, I love those.
It's like installing an incredibly advanced operating system, something designed to run a massive utopian smart city, but you install it onto severely corrupted, outdated hardware.
Right, the human element.
Exactly. While the lead developer is standing right there forcing it to compile, it works. The city runs. But over time, the users, they get lazy.
They always do.
Maintaining complex socioeconomic code is really difficult. Rebuilding an economy is hard work.
It's exhausting.
But giving a little bit of money to charity and chanting a prayer, that's easy. So they slowly shrink this massive complex system down into a simple checklist of rituals.
Yes, exactly.
And they create a religious monopoly to maintain power, rather than actually doing the work of maintaining a functional society.
The users look for shortcuts. They abandon the structural requirements of the system and replace them with superstitions.
Which brings us perfectly to Zechariah.
It does. That systemic degradation is the exact socio-political environment we find Zechariah dealing with. Let's get into verses 89 to 90.
Okay, so let's look at verse 89. Zechariah is praying for an heir. Under the traditional surface-level view, this is just a really sad, sweet story.
An old man who wants a son.
Yeah, an old man who wants a boy to carry on his family name or maybe inherit his farm. But if we apply our new paradigm, if we look at Zechariah as a system architect and not a monk, his anxiety is about something much more profound, right?
It is an operational crisis. Zechariah did not have massive wealth or a kingdom or an aristocratic title to pass down.
Right.
He was the custodian of an ideological movement. He was the caretaker of the systemic data ledger, so to speak.
The blueprints we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And he was looking around at his society, observing the people who were supposed to inherit the leadership of this movement, and he realized They were completely corrupted.
The hardware was failing.
They had completely reverted to the outdated hardware. So the ideological movement was facing a total human capital dead end.
Oh, wow. So if he died without a capable successor.
If he died without someone who was raised with the exact intellectual and systemic rigor required to run this architecture, the entire movement would collapse.
The data ledger would just be lost to the corrupted temple system.
Completely lost. So his prayer for an heir isn't about personal legacy at all. It is a desperate plea for human capital.
That makes so much more sense.
It is a critical issue of civilizational continuity.
He needs a successor to guarantee the system survives. Which brings us to verse 90. And this is where the traditional translations really lean hard into the magic.
Oh, they do.
The text says, وَلِنَنْ لَهُ زَوْجَهُ. And the superstitious reading says God just magically cured his barren wife in an instant, like a spontaneous healing spell.
Right, flash of light and she's cured.
Exactly. But the source does an intense linguistic breakdown here, and I want to dive into that. What does that Arabic root actually mean in a rationalist context?
Well, the root word is Allah.
Mm.
And linguistically, it absolutely does not mean a cartoonish magical miracle.
What does it mean?
It means structural rectification. It means alignment, repairing a defect, or basically optimization.
Optimization. I mean, that is a very clinical scientific term.
Very much so.
But wait, hold on. You're telling me a 90-year-old man and his barren wife had a child purely through optimization. I'm sorry, but biology is biology.
Sure.
How does the source justify that without invoking some kind of supernatural miracle? What does environmental optimization even look like in a physical context?
We have to remember that barrenness in antiquity was often not a permanent, irreversible genetic failure.
Oh, really?
Right. It was very often a biological suppression caused by severe environmental stress, dietary deficiencies, or extreme psychological stress.
Oh, I see.
So the system didn't bypass biology. It optimized their physiological and domestic environment. It corrected the specific medical or structural deficits of his partner to restore her natural biological reproductive capacity.
Are we talking about relieving the crushing psychological stress of their socio-political situation, changing their environment entirely?
We are talking about aligning their physical and environmental reality with the laws of nature. The source highlights a really foundational principle here, which is key to this whole deep dive.
What's the principle?
The universe's creator never violates his own physical laws.
Never.
Never. The laws of biology, physics, cause and effect, these are the very laws instituted by the creator to govern the cosmos.
So breaking them would be a contradiction.
Exactly. To violate them through a magic trick would be a contradiction of the system itself.
This is a massive shift for anyone who grew up with the standard narrative. The text is demanding we look at it through a strictly rationalist lens, completely grounded in cause and effect.
Absolutely grounded.
So when it says, وَلَنَ اللَّهُ زَوْجَهُ, it's essentially saying we provided the necessary medical, physical, or environmental alignment to repair the biological defect.
Right, allowing the natural law of reproduction to take its course.
It totally removes the need for supernatural suspension of reality. It was a demographic intervention, but one achieved through the optimization of natural systems, not the breaking of them.
You nailed it. And this optimization of human capital, this protection of the ideological lineage, it flows immediately into the very next verse.
Verse 91.
Yes. Verse 91 brings us to the story of Mary.
Now, I have always wondered about this because Mary is included in this unbroken chain of systemic revolutionaries here, even though she's not traditionally categorized as a prophet.
Right. She's usually seen as a devout figure, but not a prophet.
Yeah. So why is she the centerpiece of this systemic continuation?
Because of the macro-sociological stand she took.
Her stand.
Think about the environment Mary was operating in. By her time, the systemic degradation we discussed earlier, the software running on bad hardware, it was nearly absolute.
Right.
The original socioeconomic architecture had been entirely replaced by a massive, deeply corrupt monastic and temple system.
The religious monopoly.
A self-appointed religious priesthood held a total monopoly on faith, law, and the economy.
Yeah.
They oppressed humanity under the guise of piety.
They gatekept God. They basically operated as a massive religious megacorporation, controlling the entire economy through tithes and ritual requirements.
They absolutely did. And Mary's true miracle, when viewed strictly through this rationalist lens, was her immense, almost incomprehensible courage.
Wow.
She stood up as a solitary individual, a young woman in a fiercely patriarchal society,
Yeah.
and directly challenged this massive corrupt monopoly.
So she wasn't just this quiet, passive mystic sitting in a corner praying all day.
No, not at all.
She was a whistleblower. She was a macro-sociological revolutionary.
She rebelled against the superstition and the exploitation of the temple system. Her inclusion in this specific text isn't just about the biological birth of Jesus.
Right.
It is about her role as an active, courageous agent of systemic defiance. She protected the ideological lineage by intellectually and socially resisting the very forces that were trying to destroy it. She was the guardian of the true systemic law.
So Mary was fighting against the monopolies that corrupt human societies?
Yes.
But that naturally leads to the next question. I mean, if Mary's rebellion was necessary because human monopolies inevitably corrupt the system, there has to be an underlying physics law that ensures a pure system actually survives, right?
You think so?
Like, does the text provide a mechanism to prevent that corruption in the first place?
It does. And it is the ultimate sociological principle of the entire text. It is addressed immediately in the next section, verses 92 and 93.
Okay, let's unpack those.
It's the principle of absolute unity.
Let's read verse 92. It says, humanity is designed to be one single community, united by a single universal law.
What the source calls the systemic center.
The systemic center. And it completely disregards our artificial boundaries, like race, geography, language, nationality, none of it matters. The text calls humanity ummatan wahidatan,
A single human family.
a single human family.
The source treats this as a hard, systemic imperative. It's not just a poetic sentiment where we all hold hands and sing songs.
It's structural.
Yes, think of it structurally. If you have a single creator and a single set of universal physical laws governing the cosmos like gravity, thermodynamics, then the sociological laws governing humanity must also be singular and universal.
That's a fascinating leap.
True justice and optimal human development can only occur when the species operates as an integrated whole, adhering to an objective standard of law.
But, I mean, we look at history and we see the exact opposite of that.
Oh, completely.
We see humanity constantly fracturing itself, which is exactly what verse 93 outlines.
Verse 93 describes the catastrophic failure of humanity to maintain this unified operating system. The text says, takiyat.
Katatia, meaning what?
It means they fractured their unity into sectarian pieces. Humanity constantly invents artificial divisions. We draw arbitrary borders on maps, we create nationalistic identities, and we invent thousands of different clerical sects.
And the text treats this fracturing as an intellectual crime, right? It's an active sabotage of civilizational efficiency.
It is the ultimate crime against human potential.
Right.
The source argues that sectarianism, this division based on unproven tribal and political assertions, destroys the mechanism of progress.
Right.
When you fracture humanity, you fracture the law. You end up with competing standards of justice, economic systems that exploit one another, and just continuous, endless conflict.
Let me bring in a technology analogy here because it maps perfectly onto what you're saying.
Oh, please do.
Think about the infrastructure of the internet. The entire power of the internet is that it is a unified protocol.
Right.
A computer in Tokyo can talk instantly to a computer in London because they all agree on the exact same foundational rules. TCP/IP.
Yes.
That is ummatan wahidatan. That is the single community functioning as one.
That's a great way to visualize it.
But now, imagine if humanity fractured that. Imagine if Europe built an internet that completely refused to communicate with Asia's internet.
It would be chaos.
Imagine if every single city had its own isolated intranet, using a totally different coding language. And they actively built firewalls to block data from the neighboring city just because they didn't like their politics.
The efficiency of global communication would instantly collapse. The sharing of knowledge, the economic interconnectedness, it would all be destroyed by artificial, unproven assertions of tribal superiority.
Exactly. It is terrible systems engineering. Sectarianism, nationalism, racial division, it's like intentionally installing malware.
Malware that breaks the global network.
Yes, into thousands of incompatible pieces that actively sabotage each other.
That captures the exact warning of verse 93 perfectly. When humanity breaks its unified system into factions, they are choosing the tyranny of unproven assertions over the engine of reason.
They choose tribalism over progress.
They are choosing exploitation over collective advancement.
So, if humanity is meant to function as this unified global network, there must be a law of physics governing whether that network succeeds or fails.
Right.
If this is a highly rational text, it wouldn't just say be unified and leave it at that. It would provide the mathematical guarantee.
And it does in verse 94. This transitions us into what we can call social physics.
Social physics, I love that term.
Verse 94 outlines the fundamental economic and social security guarantee of the entire system. The phrase used here is la kufrana li saisi.
Okay, let's do another linguistic breakdown. What does sa'i mean?
Sa'i is physical productive exertion. It is constructive labor.
Okay.
The universe, according to this text, runs on a strict, unbreakable conservation law, very much like the conservation of energy in thermodynamics.
Okay, so energy cannot be created or destroyed.
Exactly. This law states that no constructive, productive labor is ever lost, wasted, or uncompensated.
But wait, we see people working hard and getting exploited all the time.
We do.
I mean, people labor their entire lives in sweatshops or fields, and they die in total poverty. How can the text claim that no labor is lost?
Well, that is exactly the distinction the text is making. The text is providing the blueprint for the correct system, the unified system.
Ah.
In our current fractured, sectarian, exploitative systems, labor is constantly stolen. It is alienated from the worker.
Right.
But verse 94 is laying out the physics of a system aligned with universal justice. If humanity builds an infrastructure aligned with that single unified law, then the law of requital kicks in.
Action and reaction, cause and effect.
Precisely. If the societal infrastructure is just, the text says, "Wainahu katibun," meaning we are recording it.
The system logs the data.
The system instantly logs that constructive data. It guarantees compounding positive returns. Every ounce of productive exertion strengthens the society, elevates human potential, and guarantees security for everyone.
So in a properly engineered society, the infrastructure literally captures the value of your labor and returns it to you. It's an absolute economic security guarantee. But, this brings up a massive, fiery critique from the source regarding our modern systems.
The charity critique.
Yes. When we talk about a just society, most people immediately think about charity, giving money to the poor, philanthropy.
Right.
But the source completely eviscerates the traditional religious concept of charity.
It exposes it as a mask for systemic exploitation. The source uses a very, very visceral example here.
Tell me.
It points to people who spend their entire day sucking the blood of the poor, exploiting workers, hoarding wealth, engaging in predatory economic practices, driving wages into the ground.
The worst of the worst.
But then they wake up the next morning, scatter a little handful of grain for the birds, or drop a single coin in a beggar's cup, and they think they have achieved piety.
Wow, scattering grain for birds while you're the architect of a system that actively starves humans? It's the equivalent of a billionaire CEO who busts unions and pays poverty wages, but then donates a fraction of a percent of his wealth to an art museum and calls himself a philanthropist.
It's a psychological band-aid for systemic cruelty. The expert analysis here clarifies that true systemic justice, that word we learned earlier, is structural optimization.
Right.
It is not about giving charity to beggars. If your system requires constant charity just to keep people from dying in the streets, your system is fundamentally diseased.
True structural equity is building a system where exploitation is eliminated entirely, so no one is ever forced to beg in the first place.
The law of requital in a unified society ensures that the structure itself provides equity. Charity is a symptom of a failed state.
I love that. Charity is a symptom of a failed state. So we've established the physics of positive momentum. If a unified society engages in constructive labor, the system logs it and compounds the prosperity.
Right.
But what happens when a civilization reads this blueprint, ignores it completely, and deliberately chooses the path of exploitation and sectarianism?
The descent.
Yeah, walk me through the sociological pipeline of collapse.
That brings us directly to verse 95. If verse 94 is the physics of prosperity, verse 95 is the mathematics of collapse.
Mathematics of collapse.
The phrase used is Ramun alakuratan alakna.
What does alakna mean in the context of social physics?
It refers to a state of systemic liquidation.
Liquidation.
When a corrupt civilization, an empire built on the exact exploitation we just discussed, ignores the warning signs and continues to degrade its own foundation, it eventually crosses a critical tipping point.
The point of no return.
It represents the absolute mathematical constant of historical momentum. Once that threshold is crossed into systemic liquidation, its doom becomes irreversible.
Irreversible.
It is structurally, mathematically impossible for that society to reverse its decay or return to its former state of prosperity. The phrase is, Anohum le yarjin, they shall not return.
Think about being on a massive commercial airplane. You're speeding down the runway, but the engines are failing, the wings have structural damage, and the pilots are arguing over nationalistic politics instead of flying the plane.
A terrible situation.
They reach the end of the runway, they cross the line. At that exact millisecond, it is physically impossible for the plane to stop safely, and it is aerodynamically impossible for it to fly.
Wow.
The crash is guaranteed. The physics of the disaster are locked in before the plane even hits the ground.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Or consider an astronomical event, like a dying star. Once a star's core collapses under its own gravity and it crosses the event horizon, it becomes a black hole.
Right. Nothing escapes.
No amount of light, energy, or wishful thinking can ever escape it again. The system has literally eaten itself.
The civilization has consumed its own structural integrity, and the source grounds this in historical reality, too. It points to wandering, historically displaced populations.
Communities that just lost their systemic footing entirely. We've seen it with things like the Bronze Age collapse or the fall of the Roman Empire.
Civilizations that failed to maintain an equitable structure. They didn't just have a temporary economic downturn. They lost their cohesive civilization entirely.
They were liquidated.
They survived only as fractured, displaced remnants scattered across the globe, continually facing the consequences of their systemic failure. The historical momentum just crushed them.
But history abhors a vacuum.
It always does.
When the structural integrity of a global empire completely fails and it reaches that point of systemic liquidation, it leaves a massive power vacuum.
A very dangerous vacuum.
How exactly does the lack of a unified justice system inevitably spawn the horrors we read about next?
Well,
What forces rush in to fill that void?
This is where we reach the climax of the briefing, verse 96. And this is where we finally encounter the most infamous villains of theological folklore.
Yes.
Yajuj and Majuj, Gog and Magog.
I have been waiting for this part the whole time. If we are really committed to this rationalist lens, we have to strip the goblin folklore away permanently. No magical iron wall. No ugly little creatures living in the center of the earth licking their way out to eat humanity.
Goblins.
If we apply the exact same rigorous methodology to verse 96, what are Yajuj and Majuj?
To understand them, we have to look at their linguistic roots again. The source traces these names back to the Arabic root Ajij.
Aja, what does that translate to?
It means the roaring, unbridled, all-consuming flames of an unchecked fire.
Oh, wow. So it's not a creature at all. It's a force of nature.
A macro-sociological force of nature. Yajuj and Majuj do not represent literal monsters.
Yep.
They represent hyper-aggressive, out-of-control global forces.
Okay.
They are the ultimate manifestation of unchecked exploitation.
We are talking about predatory economic empires,
Right.
massive exploitative military-industrial complexes,
Very good.
global colonizers,
Sure, right.
multinational monopolies that act like a forest fire across the globe.
Yes. When a civilization's regulatory boundaries fail, when the dam of justice and equitable law we discussed in verse 94 completely collapses, these hyper-aggressive forces are unleashed.
The fire spreads.
And the text describes exactly how they arise. It says, Min kulli adaben yansilin. Now, traditionally, people imagined monsters digging out of a hole in the ground.
Right, coming from below.
But adab actually means an elevated place, a height.
So they don't come from underground. They erupt from the heights.
They erupt from every height of corporate, economic, and geopolitical power.
Wow.
When the global security structure collapses, these predatory forces don't sneak in through the back door. They descend from the highest towers of power to cannibalize global stability.
They just consume everything in their path.
They sweep across the earth like a roaring fire, consuming resources, destroying infrastructure, and leaving nothing but devastation behind.
Can you give us a concrete historical example? How does the source actually contextualize this?
It points to the destructive waves of ancient empires, like the Mongol hordes that swept across Asia and into Europe.
Okay, right.
They functioned exactly like a rapid consuming fire that decimated entire civilizations. But the source also points to modern manifestations.
Like what?
Impartially speaking, it looks at the colonial eras. Think of the Dutch East India Company or the British Empire.
Oh, the ultimate corporate and military heights.
Yes. They use their heights of naval and economic power to sweep across continents, extract wealth, exploit local populations, and leave colonized nations structurally devastated.
So these aren't monsters from a fairy tale.
Not at all. They are the real-world historical manifestations of the unchecked fire. They are what happens when the global system of justice fails.
Let's pull this entire architectural blueprint together for the listener, because the journey we just went on today is staggering.
It really is a complete 180.
We started with what looked like a collection of disjointed fairy tales about magic babies and underground goblins, but the source has revealed it to be a cohesive, terrifyingly relevant warning for the modern world.
A warning we desperately need.
Human civilization is an interconnected ecosystem. It is an incredibly fragile operating system. Either we choose to run this system on the physics of unified justice, long-term human capital optimization, and the strict physical laws of cause and effect.
Or we don't.
Exactly. And if we choose sectarianism, if we choose to build our wealth on the exploitation of others, and then throw a little grain to the birds to feel better about ourselves, our systemic dams will inevitably break.
They will break.
And when they do, the airplane runs out of runway. The tipping point into systemic liquidation is crossed, and we get completely consumed by the chaotic, roaring tides of Yajuj and Majuj, the unchecked fires of global exploitation descending from the heights of power.
The collapse of the global dam, when the physical laws of historical momentum take over, is absolute. But, that raises a monumental question.
Oh.
A massive cliffhanger that points directly to the final acts of this Surah.
Tell me.
When the dam breaks, and when the dust finally clears from the apocalyptic chaos of Yajuj and Majuj, what happens to the remaining assets?
Oh, wow.
When the predatory empires have finally burned themselves out, who inherits a scorched earth planet?
If you have the blueprint and the whole world burns down because they ignored it, who gets to build the next city?
Exactly. Who inherits the ashes?
That is a chilling thought to leave off on. We are going to explore exactly who inherits the ashes in Lecture 1213, covering Surah 21, Ayat 97-102.
I can't wait for that one.
But until then, remember, you can't run a civilization on fairy tales. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.